greatest differences that exist between professional learning community conversations and the conversations that historically took place in grade level meetings at the elementary level, or team meetings at middle schools, or department meetings at high schools, is the switch from the conversation being focused on teaching to being focused on learning. The reason that we tend to be more comfortable talking about teaching is because teaching can be neat, orderly, sequential, managed, and documented. We can take the required curriculum, we can lay it out on calendars, we can scope and sequence it. As an administrator, we can require teachers to identify which of the standards they're addressing in a lesson. And as a teacher, I can teach the standard, test it, and now that I've tested it, I have proof that I taught it. Yeah, in that blank is where a lot of folks like to try and squeeze in, they learned it. But if I teach a standard and immediately after teaching the standard, I test the standard, that tends not to be a good indication that the learning occurred. And the reason for that is that learning is often messy, spontaneous, irregular, nonlinear, and complex. So for me, that tension that's caused between the teaching and the learning really guides for me what that conversation in a professional learning community would often deal with. I describe a teacher as going through the day as if they have a bird on each shoulder. And on one shoulder is the teaching bird, kind of called the pacing guide, and it's yelling into the teacher's ear, move on, move on. And on the other shoulder, we find the learning bird, usually the voice of a child, crying out, wait for me. And the struggle of the teacher in making decisions about what do I do now, what do I do next, with those two voices being heard. To me, making that decision is a reason for me to work within the professional learning community. I want to be sure that the message isn't missed here. I had put up the teaching learning struggle in an audience of teachers, and I had someone in the back of the room yell out, "I've known it all along." And I said, "Oh, sir, please share your insights with the group." And the person said, "Well, I've been telling my principal for years there's no need to plan." And that's not quite the message I wanted to get her. I said, "Sir, planning is extremely important. You can't get the teaching side of this, or the learning side of this, if the teaching side isn't happening. It's not a matter that the teaching side is bad and the learning side is good. It's a matter of how do I balance that focus." So I said to the gentleman, I said, "It's critical that you do that planning, or I can't get that learning to occur. What I want to be important of is that I don't just deliver the teaching the way I planned it and miss collecting the feedback that I need to decide how that learning is occurring." So in looking at how to address that teaching learning struggle, it caused me to decide that teachers really need to study learning and study student work. As I processed that, I realized teaching really comes down to 4 critical strategies. And I called those strategies thinking, creating, experimenting, and observing. And the 4 are interconnected, a teacher constantly moving back and forth between the 4. So if you thought of the example where it's the beginning of the year and you're planning instruction for students you haven't met yet, you don't know a whole lot about the students. So you probably start at that thinking stage. You identify who you think your students are, who do I expect to be showing up in my class, what are the standards that those students need to meet. And thinking about the standards and thinking about who my students are, I move into that creative component. I'm going to create a learning strategy. I'm going to design my instruction. I'm going to pick the video clip that I'm going to show to get kids engaged in questioning and thinking and walking into the learning. And then the experiment begins when the students show up. Now that the student's there, I'm going to engage the students in what I created, and that experiment of learning begins. At that point, the observing role of the teacher enters. And with the standards in mind, I begin to observe the student's response in this learning process. And now I think about what I'm observing. And in my thinking about what I'm observing, I might decide that I missed it. I really don't have the match of the appropriate learning activity to the students. Enter the recreating process. The more skilled the teacher becomes, the more quickly the teacher goes through that process. I recall working with a beginning teacher, and I shared with the teacher that I had some time that day. I could probably drop into his class about second period. And the teacher said to me, I wish you could come fifth. And I said, why? And he said, well, it's usually pretty good by then. And I congratulated him on his development of his teaching process, because what he was sharing with me is his observation each period allowed him to think and then redesign, and he was in that continuous improvement process of teaching and learning. So when I step into the role of being an instructional leader, an instructional coach, I can actually express it as stepping inside the circle of that teacher's role of thinking, creating, experimenting, and observing. So the role of that instructional coach, that instructional leader, is to increase what's happening for the teacher in each of those areas. So because a coach was in my classroom and the coach provides me what he or she saw, I now observe things that I wouldn't have observed if I hadn't been working with the coach. My conversation with the coach causes me to think of things. The questions of my coach cause me to think about things that I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't been in that coaching process. For most of us, working with another person or group increases our creativity. So the ideas that I generate about how to cause that learning to occur increase. And hopefully, working with a coach increases a teacher's experimentation. I'm more comfortable experimenting because of the supportive role that I'm getting from my instructional leader or instructional coach. Now, the same is true for being in a professional learning community. When I take my student work to a professional learning community, I lay it down and I have everyone looking at my student work. Again, I observe things that I wouldn't have observed on my own. When I enter that conversation with my colleagues, I think about things about my student work that I wouldn't have thought about. Again, the creativity of the group supports me in coming up with ideas for how I can approach the learning in another way for a student who hasn't mastered it. And lastly, my confidence to experiment because my experiment makes sense to my colleagues. My colleagues are there to support me as a PLC. Matter of fact, maybe as a group we're sharing the experiment. We're each going back to our classrooms and using the design that we came up with and testing out whether it has that impact on student achievement. Our goal then is to continually look at refining our ability to impact student achievement by studying how learning is happening.